My name is Jerry Hollingsworth. I am a published author. I was reared in the small town of Oxford, Mississippi. I chose the book, To Kill a Mockingbird, primarily because it was about an event that transpired in a small town in the 1930s in Alabama. It has been banned by at least 16 school districts over the last 40 years due to some of its content. It is a book that demonstrates a large amount of courage, doing the right thing when it is unnecessarily the popular thing. And for that, it is the sole reason I picked To Kill a Mockingbird. I'm going to read to you a small section passage out of it. One afternoon, a month later, Jim was plowing his way through Sir Walter Scout, as Jim called him, and Mrs. DuBose was correcting him at every turn when there was a knock on the door. "Come in," she screamed. Atticus came in. He went to the bed and took Mrs. DuBose's hand. "I was coming from the office and didn't see the children," he said. "I thought they still might be here." Mrs. DuBose smiled at him. For the life of me, I could not figure out how she could bring herself to speak to him when she seemed to hate him so. "Do you know what time it is, Atticus?" she said. "Exactly 14 minutes past 5. The alarm clock's set for 5:30. I want you to know that." It suddenly came to me that each day we had been staying a little longer at Mrs. DuBose, that the alarm clock went off a few minutes later each day, and that she was well into one of her fits by the time it sounded. Today, she had antagonized Jim for nearly 2 hours, with no intention of having a fit, and I felt hopelessly trapped. The alarm clock was the signal for our release. If one day it did not ring, what would we do? "I have a feeling that Jim's reading days are numbered," said Atticus. "Only a week longer, I think," she said, just to make sure. Jim rose, but Atticus put his hand on, and Jim was silent. On the way home, Jim said he had to do it just for a month, and the month was up, and it wasn't fair. "Just one more week, son," said Atticus. "No," said Jim. "Yes," said Atticus. The following week found us back at Mrs. DuBose. The alarm clock had ceased sounding, but Mrs. DuBose would release us with, "That'll do." So late in the afternoon, Atticus would be home reading the paper when we returned. Although her fits had passed off, she was in every way her old self. When Sir Walter Scott became involved in lengthy descriptions of moats and castles, Mrs. DuBose would become bored and picked on us. "Jeremy Finch, I told you you'd live to regret tearing up my camellias. You regret it now, don't you?" Jim would say he certainly did. "Thought you would kill my snow on the mountain, didn't you?" "Well, Jessie says the top's growing back out. Next time you'll know how to do it right, won't you? You'll pull it up by the roots, won't you?" Jim would say he certainly would. "Don't you mutter at me, boy. You hold up your head and say, 'Yes, ma'am.' Don't guess you'd feel like holding it up, though, with what your father, what he is." Jim's chin would come up, and he would gaze at Mrs. DuBose, and a face devoid of resentment. Through the weeks, he had cultivated an expression of polite and detached interest, which he would present to her in answer to her most blood-curdling inventions. At last the day came when Mrs. DeBow said, "That'll do." One afternoon she added, "And that's all. Good day to you." It was over. We bound down the sidewalk on a spree of sheer relief, leaping and howling. That spring was a good one. The days grew longer and gave us more playing time. Jim's mind was occupied mostly with the vital statistics of every college football player in the nation. Every night, Atticus would read us sports pages of the newspapers. Alabama might go to the Rose Bowl again this year, judging from its prospects, not one of whose names we could pronounce. Atticus was in the middle of Wendy Seaton's column one afternoon when the telephone rang. He answered it, then went to the hat rack in the hall. "I'm going down to Mrs. DeBow's for a while," he said. "I won't be long." But Atticus stayed away until long past my bedtime. When he returned, he was carrying a candy box. Atticus sat down in the living room and put the box on the floor beside this chair. "What'd she want?" asked Jim. We had not seen Mrs. DeBow's for over a month. She was never on the porch anymore when we passed. "She's dead, son," said Atticus. "She died a few minutes ago." "Oh," said Jim. Well is right," said Atticus. "She's not suffering anymore. She was sick for a long time. Son, didn't you know what her fits were?" Jim shook his head. "Mrs. DeBow's was a morphine addict," said Atticus. "She took it as painkiller for years. The doctor put her on it. She'd have spent the rest of her life on it and died without so much agony, but she was too contrary." "Sir," said Jim. Atticus said, "Just before your escapade, she called me to make her will. Dr. Reynolds told her she had only a few months left. Her business affairs were in perfect order, but she said, there's still one thing out of order." "What was that?" Jim was perplexed. "She said she was going to leave this world beholden to nothing and nobody. Jim, when you're sick as she was, it's all right to take anything to make it easier. But it wasn't all right for her. She said she meant to break herself of it before she died. And that's what she did." Jim said, "You mean that's what her fits were?" "Yes, that's what they were. Most of the time you were reading to her, I doubt if she heard a word you said. Her whole mind and body were concentrated on that alarm clock. If you hadn't fallen into her hands, I'd have made you go to read to her anyway. It may have been some distraction. There was another reason." "Did she die free?" asked Jim.